Welcome. Tonight, we step softly into a world long forgotten by time, but never by those who lived it. Behind stone walls and iron gates, beneath the gray skies of industrial England, there were places where the poor, the orphaned, the elderly, and the desperate sought shelter, and often found something far colder. The Victorian workhouse was not just a building, it was a system, a way of life, a judgment passed by society onto its most vulnerable. This journey is not one of drama or sensationalism. It is one of stillness, of quiet footsteps across worn floors, whispered prayers before dawn, and the rustle of uniforms all made to look the same. In the hours ahead, you'll hear their stories gathered from real records, letters, and reflections. Some voices are filled with sorrow, others with resilience, all of them human. So settle in, let your body rest, let your thoughts slow. And before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment below. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always comforting to know who's listening in the stillness of the night. Now, let's begin. The air was damp and heavy, laced with coal dust and the dull scent of ash. It clung to the worn brick walls and the looming iron gates of the workhouse like a fog that wouldn't lift. The year was 1840, and in this corner of industrial England, another day began like so many others with the arrival of the desperate. The workhouse was not a place people entered by choice. It was a last resort, the end of the road for those who had nowhere left to go. For many, the gate wasn't just a threshold. It was a dividing line between life as they once knew it and a new, harsher existence. A place where the rules were absolute, the dignity stripped bare, and the future uncertain. Families arrived bundled in layers of threadbare clothing, their belongings carried in knotted cloth sacks or faded satchels. Mothers clutching infants, fathers with downcast eyes, and children too young to understand the weight of where they were. The gates creaked open, revealing a world that felt as cold and hard as the stone it was built upon. There was no warmth in the greeting, no smile, no comfort. The porter, dressed in a dark uniform, called out names from a ledger. Each family stepped forward, their names written down in Inca name in a book, nothing more. From the moment they crossed that line, they belonged to the workhouse. It began with separation. Men were sent in one direction, women in another. Children were often taken elsewhere entirely. The practice was routine, but brutal. A young boy's hand might be torn from his mother's, his cries ignored as he was led down a corridor lined with locked doors. Sisters were split from brothers, husbands from wives, all under the justification of order. For those inside the walls, identity began to blur. Real names were used less frequently. Inmates, as they were often called, were known by numbers or by man or woman, boy or girl. Last names were recorded for accounting, but the human soul behind them slowly faded with time. Upon entry, newcomers were given a compulsory bath. The water was cold, the soap harsh, and the process humiliating. Attendants watched over them as they scrubbed away what was considered dirt, but to many, it felt as though they were being washed of their humanity. Clothing came next. No personal garments were allowed. Instead, the workhouse issued rough wool uniforms identical for each man, woman, and child, all shades of gray. It was a visual reminder that the outside world no longer applied. They were no longer individuals. They were the poor, the dependent, the burdened. Hair was cut, fingernails checked, shoes replaced if they had any to begin with. Any belongings, keepsakes, photographs, trinkets were taken and stored away. Most never saw them again. The rules were strict, posted plainly on the walls in every room. No speaking without permission, no idleness, no disobedience. All were expected to rise at the same time, eat the same food, and follow the same schedule. To some, this rigidity provided a strange sense of structure after chaos. But to most, it felt like prison with no sentence, because there was no guarantee of leaving. Children entering the workhouse for the first time often experienced the most visible fear. Many cried quietly, wiping tears with their sleeves as they watched their parents disappear through doors they couldn't follow. For many, it was the beginning of years of institutional life, raised not by love, but by regulation. And yet, even in the face of this, there were moments, small flickers of humanity. A nurse offering an extra piece of bread to a hungry child. A matron allowing a mother to hold her baby a moment longer before they were taken away. But these were rare, and always in tension with the rules. Inside the reception room, the walls were bare except for a few religious prints and lists of expectations. A long wooden table stretched the length of the room, behind which sat a clerk who reviewed each family's story. Questions were asked about occupation, age, health, and finances. Every answer was written down, categorized, assessed. The workhouse wanted to know exactly what kind of burden it was taking in. Many applicants came after being turned away from parish relief. A Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had made it significantly harder to receive help unless one was willing to enter the workhouse. It was a system designed to make the prospect of aid so uncomfortable that only the most desperate would accept it. And it worked. Standing at the gate, many hesitated. Some turned away. Pride kept them outside a little longer, even if it meant hunger or cold. Others had no such luxury. The gate closed behind them, shutting out the world. From that point on, the rhythm of life was no longer their own. Every hour of the day was mapped out. Wake at dawn, wash, eat, work, pray, sleep, repeat. As evening approached on that first day, many sat in silence in their designated dormitories, large, echoing rooms with rows of narrow beds. The walls were damp, the air filled with the scent of boiled potatoes and worn shoes. A dull quiet settled over everything. There was no laughter, no chatter. Some tried to whisper prayers. Others stared at the ceiling, wondering what they had become. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters, but within, all was still. The workhouse was not cruel by accident. It was cruel by design. It was meant to discourage poverty, as if hunger and hardship were the result of moral failure. But poverty had many faces. Some came because of injury, unable to work. Others came because wages were cut and there was no bread left at home. Some were widows, some were orphans, some were simply unlucky. The workhouse made no distinction. It treated all the same. Yet behind every pair of eyes that passed through those gates was a story. A lost job, a failed harvest, a death in the family, a storm that swept away everything. Every arrival was the end of a road paved with sorrow. As night fell on their first day, the new inmates lay in beds that felt too stiff, beneath blankets that felt too thin. They listened to the sounds of others breathing, to the cough of a man in the far corner, to the whispered sobs of a child trying not to be heard. And slowly, sleep came not as rest, but as escape. The next day, they would be assigned work. Some to the laundry, others to the stone yard or kitchen. Children to lessons or to labor. But on that first night, they were simply the new arrivals. The newest to cross through the iron gates and into a world where everything was controlled, except, perhaps, the memory of the lives they had once known. At the very heart of every workhouse stood a figure who loomed larger than any rulebook or iron gate, the workhouse master. To the new arrivals, this man represented the embodiment of law, order, and sometimes even punishment. He was the first human barrier between desperation and survival, and the one who decided how their life behind these walls would unfold. Often dressed in a high-collared coat and carrying himself with military precision, the master was a man accustomed to command. Many had served in the military, bringing with them a style of management that prized discipline, routine, and unquestioned obedience. Others were former clergy or officials, men who believed deeply in hierarchy, moral reform, and the power of structure. The master's office was usually placed near the entrance of the workhouse, a symbolic reminder that every person who entered must first pass under his judgment. It was a cold room, functional, sparse, and efficient. A desk, a few chairs, stacks of paper, and a bell to summon assistance. The room smelled faintly of ink, old paper, and a lingering tension that seemed to soak into the floorboards. When a new arrival came to the workhouse, they were brought directly to this room. The first conversation they had was not one of comfort or welcome, but of questioning. What had brought them here? Why had they no work? Were they truly destitute? The master would peer at them over wire-rimmed spectacles, taking notes as they stammered out their story. Some lied, fearing rejection or shame. Others told the truth with trembling voices, hoping that honesty might buy a scrap of compassion. But compassion was rarely the priority. The poor law, which governed these institutions, was designed not to comfort but to deter, and the master's job was to uphold it. He would assess their worthiness to enter. This was not always a matter of need. A man who appeared able-bodied might be deemed undeserving. A woman with children might be met with suspicion. Every decision had to be recorded, justified, and in many cases, approved by the board of guardians, wealthy local men who rarely set foot inside but held the real power. The master did not work alone. His wife often served as the matron, managing the women and children. Together, they were the ruling force of the workhouse, a king and queen in a kingdom of hardship. After the initial interview, if accepted, the newcomers would be issued workhouse uniforms and their names written into the register. Family members were separated. Men went to the male ward, women to the female ward, children to the nursery or schoolroom. The master oversaw all of it, ensuring that the rules were followed and that no one received more than the bare minimum. The master's authority extended beyond administration. He controlled punishments, privileges, and even the smallest aspects of daily life. A loaf of bread withheld, an extra chore added, a visitor turned away. His decisions were final, and appeals were rare. Despite this, some masters were known to show a certain quiet kindness, a nod of understanding, a word of encouragement. But these moments were few and far between, and almost always hidden behind a mask of sternness. In the silence of that office, as the master turned back to his paperwork, the newly arrived inmate would walk out into their new life marked, monitored, and molded by the man they had just met. The workhouse had many rooms, many rules, and many trials. But everything began and ended in the master's office. There were few symbols more defining in the workhouse than the uniform. The moment a person crossed the threshold, passed through the master's office, and was accepted into the care of the institution, they were stripped quite literally of their former life. Whatever clothes they wore when they arrived were taken from them, sometimes gently, often hurriedly, always decisively. In return, they were handed a uniform. It was gray, always gray, a dull, lifeless shade that seemed to reflect the tone of the place itself. The material was coarse, itchy against the skin. It was not tailored to fit, but rather made to erase. A garment not designed for warmth, nor even for function, but for symbolism. It was meant to depersonalize. Each adult man was given a loose shirt and trousers, made from scratchy wool or cotton blend. Women were handed shapeless dresses with aprons and bonnets, garments that robbed them of age, status, or any form of personal style. The children wore miniature versions of the same. No colors, no embroidery, no buttons that didn't serve a purpose. Just gray fabric and uniform sameness. To the administrators, the uniforms represented equality. Within these walls, they claimed everyone was the same. But to the people forced to wear them, it felt more like erasure. A statement that whatever identity they had before the tailor from Bristol, the widow from Yorkshire, The child from Lambeth was now irrelevant. They were no longer individuals. They were inmates. It's hard to describe the psychological effect of that change, especially for children. Some had never worn anything new in their lives, so receiving clean clothes should have been a comfort. But more often than not, it felt like punishment. Girls who once wore hand-me-down dresses from older sisters were now assigned stiff aprons with no softness. Boys who ran freely through alleyways in patched-up trousers now found themselves weighed down by oversized boots and heavy cloth. For many, the clothing smelled of the laundry rooms, damp linen and lye soap. It itched in the folds of their arms, behind their knees, across their collars. It reminded them, with every movement, that they were no longer free. And it wasn't just about texture or appearance. The uniform was deeply tied to control. It allowed staff to distinguish inmates from outsiders immediately. It made escape harder. Where would a man in a gray smock hide in a village of tradesmen and shopkeepers? It also dictated behavior. Inmates knew they were being watched, even when they were silent, even when they stood in line for gruel or swept the floor of the dormitory. Any attempt to alter the uniform, to roll up the sleeves, to fix a rip with colored thread, to tie a belt differently, was seen as an act of defiance, and punishment followed. The message was clear. Conformity was survival. There are personal accounts from children who wept the day their clothes were taken. One girl remembered clutching a ribbon her mother had tied in her hair just days before. A boy spoke of how he hated the sound of his own footsteps in the new boots, the loud, echoing thuds that seemed to chase him down long hallways. Adults often internalized the humiliation. One elderly man, once a schoolteacher, wrote in his journal that it wasn't either hunger or the labor that broke him. It was the moment he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize himself. In some workhouses, identification numbers were sewn into the fabric. In others, buttons were color-coded to indicate different roles: kitchen duty, laundry, groundskeeping. All of it served the same purpose: to create order, but also to diminish the soul. On Sundays, during chapel service, the uniform was worn with a thin shawl or cap. Even in prayer, the inmates were never allowed to forget who they were and where they belonged. When death came, as it often did, the same gray uniform became a burial shroud. Bodies were wrapped, not in their best clothes, but in what they had worn every day inside the institution, marked until the very end by the fabric that had come to define them. And yet, even within this system, there were small rebellions. Some inmates found scraps of thread and secretly mended holes with invisible care. Others swapped garments for slightly better fits when the staff wasn't looking. A few mothers saved tiny pieces of their children as original clothes and tucked them under mattresses or behind loose bricks, like relics of a past life. The uniform was more than fabric. It was the first step in a process designed to reshape a person not just on the outside, but from within. And while some grew numb to it over time, others never quite accepted it, because deep down they knew a coat may keep you warm, but if it erases who you are, it leaves you colder still. The dormitory was the last stop before sleep, a place meant for rest, yet often filled with restlessness, cold, and quiet despair. It was the shared bedroom of hundreds, a vast hall of iron beds lined up in orderly rows under the harsh glow of flickering lamps. There were no walls to separate one soul from another, no curtains to shield a single tear or whispered prayer. The space was vast and impersonal, echoing with the soft sounds of breathing, shuffling feet, and the occasional cough or sob muffled against coarse blankets. Each bed was nothing more than a frame of cold iron, topped with a thin, lumpy mattress that had seen too many nights, too many restless dreams. No laughter, no song, no talk was allowed once the lights were extinguished. The quiet shuffle of a nurse checking on the sick, or the occasional whispered reprimand when an inmate was caught speaking out of turn. When the staff were distracted or far enough away, the inmates would lower their voices to near whispers, sharing memories, fears, and dreams, threads of their former lives woven softly between the beds. These whispered conversations were acts of courage, small rebellions against the oppressive rules designed to break their spirits. These patrols reminded the inmates that even in sleep, they were under watchful eyes. Privacy was a concept that did not exist here. The rule of silence was absolute, and the consequences for breaking it were swift and often cruel. The sheets were coarse linen, rough against the skin, and the blankets were worn, threadbare in places, too thin to keep out the penetrating chill that settled deep into the bones after the sun went down. Night after night, those beds became a place not of comfort, but of endurance. The dormitory's cold was relentless. The walls, built of stone and mortar, absorbed the dampness of the outside air and radiated it inward. Windows, small and high, were rarely opened, and when they were, the biting wind swept through like a ghost, carrying with it the scent of smoke, dust, and distant city streets. No matter how tightly they curled their bodies beneath their thin coverings, shivers would rack their limbs, teeth would chatter in the darkness, and the ache of chill would gnaw at their hearts. The children huddled together, small bodies pressed for warmth, seeking refuge in one another's presence. The older men and women lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, the cold sapping their strength and amplifying the fatigue from the day's hard labor. In winter, frost would form on the edges of the glass, and the cold would creep under the blankets, sneaking through every fold of fabric and every thread in the coarse uniforms. For many, the cold was more than a physical discomfort. It was a constant reminder of their vulnerability. But the dormitory was more than just a room full of beds. It was a place of silence, a silence carefully enforced by the workhouse authorities. The stillness was punctuated only by the sounds of soft footsteps from the night, watchmen their boots echoing down the stone corridors. Yet, within this heavy silence, there were moments of fragile defiance. Children would speak of summers, past days, spent running through fields, the warmth of a mother's embrace, the taste of fresh bread baked in a home kitchen. Older inmates exchanged tales of distant places, long-lost friends, or family members waiting somewhere beyond the walls. These memories were bittersweet. They carried the pain of loss, but also the comfort of connection. One child whispered about a garden she once tended with her father, a place full of blooming roses and humming bees. Another recalled the quiet evenings by the fire, reading stories aloud with siblings. These recollections, spoken softly in the dark, were the threads that kept their identities alive in a place determined to strip them away. The dormitory was also a stage for loneliness and fear. The vastness of the room magnified the feeling of isolation despite the crowds. For many, the nights were the hardest part of the day. The daytime labor, the meals, and the routines provided structure and distraction. But once darkness fell, the weight of their situation pressed down with full force. Loneliness took many forms: children who missed the sound of a parent's voice, adults grieving lost lives and opportunities, the elderly recalling a youth now gone. Some inmates suffered nightmares, haunted by the ghosts of their past or fears of what tomorrow might bring. The cold metal beds sometimes creaked under the restless movements of those unable to find peace. For the sick and weak, the dormitory was a place of slow decline. Beds were sometimes doubled up when space was tight, and disease spread easily in such close quarters. The coughing of one could quickly turn into a chorus of sickness. The sick lay shivering, their bodies racked with fever, while nurses did their best with limited resources to care for them through the long nights. Despite the harshness, there were small rituals and moments that offered comfort. Some inmates carefully folded their blankets or smoothed their sheets before lying down, small acts of control in an environment designed to take control away. A child might clutch a cherished piece of fabric, perhaps, a scrap of old clothing or a faded ribbon from a happier time, tucked beneath their pillow as a talisman against despair. Older inmates sometimes shared blankets or placed a hand gently on a neighbor's arm, offering silent solidarity. These small gestures spoke volumes in a place where words were dangerous. Even a brief touch could convey kindness, understanding, or the simple reassurance that they were not alone. The dormitory's atmosphere was shaped as much by what was forbidden as by what was allowed. The silence and the cold enforced a sense of vulnerability, but it was the rules themselves that weighed heaviest on the inmates' minds. To speak above a whisper after lights out was to risk punishment. The staff took these rules seriously, and those caught were often subjected to extra work, reduced rations, or time in isolation. Isolation was feared above almost all else. To be separated from the others in a cold, dark cell meant being cut off from what little comfort remained. For children especially, the threat of isolation was terrifying, sometimes more so than hunger or physical pain. Still, despite the risks, the inmates found ways to resist. The whispered stories, the exchanged glances, and the secret shared memories became lifelines. In the deepest silence of the dormitory, a quiet network of hope was woven between those who refused to be broken. These whispered exchanges also served another purpose. They passed down warnings and advice. Older inmates would quietly caution the young about how to avoid punishment, where the guards tended to linger, and which routines could be bent without notice. In this way, the dormitory became a classroom, teaching survival not through books, but through whispered wisdom. In the dark, where names were sometimes forgotten and replaced by numbers or labels, these moments of shared humanity were vital. They reminded each person that beyond the cold beds and gray uniforms, they were still individuals with stories, hopes, and dreams. Dreams were a secret rebellion in themselves. When sleep finally came often, after hours of tossing and turning, it brought a fragile escape. In dreams, the walls fell away. The cold vanished. Children ran through fields of wildflowers. Women felt the sun on their faces, and men heard the laughter of lost friends. But waking was always harsh. The dawn came with its own brutality, harsh light, the call to rise, the return to grueling labor. The dormitory was the place where hope was most tested, a crucible where many spirits broke, but some found the strength to hold on. Personal accounts from former inmates described these nights in vivid detail. One man recalled lying awake, listening to the soft breathing of dozens of strangers, feeling the weight of silence pressing down like a shroud. A woman wrote of the loneliness so deep she could taste it, a bitterness that lingered long after leaving the workhouse walls. Children spoke of the fear that gripped them in the dark, the shadows that seemed to move just beyond sight. Yet even in those moments of terror, the whispered stories and the shared warmth of another's body nearby were a balm proof that they were still part of something, still connected. The dormitory was a place of endings and beginnings. For some, it was where the last light in their lives flickered outworn down by cold, hunger, and sickness. For others, it was where resilience was quietly forged, where the will to survive hardened beneath the harsh rules. Though the beds were uniform, the stories that unfolded on them were not. Each person who lay there carried a lifetime of memories, losses, and hopes. In the silence, those stories lived on, whispered softly into the night, waiting for a time when they might be heard. The shrill cry of the wake-up bell shattered the fragile quiet of the dormitory. It was a sound both familiar and feared, a harsh reminder that the hours of restless sleep were over and the day's unyielding routine was about to begin. Groggy heads turned and heavy eyelids struggled to open. There was no time for comfort or dawdling. The staff were already stirring, their watchful eyes scanning the rows of beds for signs of tardiness or disobedience. A whispered command might send a child scurrying, afraid to draw unwanted attention. Some children blinked away the remnants of dreams of home, freedom, or a warm fire, but the sharp reality was impossible to ignore. There was no warmth in the meal, no laughter at the table. The coarse fabrics scratched their skin, and the dull colors offered no comfort-only reminders of the uniformity imposed on their lives. There was no choice in the matter. Every minute of the day was accounted for, every motion observed, every mistake punished. And the children had to separate usable material from waste, stacking each category in neat piles. Sometimes a child would find a scrap of joy in small acts of kindness, a shared smile with a fellow inmate, a whispered word of encouragement, or a gentle touch on a cold hand. These moments were fleeting but precious, reminders that beneath the uniform gray, the spirit still flickered. The work was repetitive and thankless, but it filled the hours and kept little hands busy. Children ate silently, faces downcast, hands trembling slightly with hunger or cold. Some lay quietly, staring at the ceiling or clutching whatever small comfort they could find, a frayed ribbon, a folded scrap of paper, a memory of home. When it did occur, it was brief and often secret. Some whispered stories to each other in hushed tones, recalling happier times or imagining futures far from these walls. They adapted, finding ways to survive the endless days and cold nights. They learned the routines, mastered the rules, and found strength in small acts of courage, whether standing up to a bully, sharing a crust of bread, or simply holding on to hope. Of friendship found in unlikely places, and of dreams that refused to be extinguished even in the darkest of places. Children would steal a few minutes to chase each other in the courtyards, or quietly roll a small rag ball between them, careful to avoid the watchful eyes of the staff. Laughter was a dangerous sound, and so it was whispered or stifled quickly. For some, it marked the end of innocence. For others, it was the beginning of a long journey toward survival, and perhaps one day, freedom. Mistakes were met with scolding or punishment, extra chores, denied meals, or worse. Reading and writing lessons, if given at all, were short and strict, designed to teach obedience as much as literacy. Many children left the workhouse with only the barest knowledge of letters and numbers, their minds shaped more by toil than by learning. There was little tolerance for tiredness or distraction. To be a child here was to live under constant pressure to conform, to obey, and to endure. The mealtime was less about nourishment and more about efficiency. There was little room for kindness in the regimented schedule. The time to leave behind the fragile safety of sleep had come. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing quietly beneath the daily grind. Children learned to eat fast, to swallow the coarse gruel and stale bread without complaint, knowing that any protest might mean less food tomorrow. For the children in the workhouse, the bell was more than a call to rise. It was a summons to a life defined by labor, discipline, and the slow fading of childhood itself. There was no gentleness in waking here. The bell's clang echoed through the stone halls, bouncing off cold walls and rattling iron beds. With stiff limbs and tired eyes, they climbed out of their beds, pulling threadbare blankets tight around their shoulders as they gathered in the dormitory. Breakfast was a quick, sparse affair, often just a thin porridge or a small piece of dry bread. The youngest might be tasked with scrubbing the stone floors, their small hands roughened by cold water and harsh soap. The scrubbing lasted hours, moving methodically from one corner to the next. The children bent low, their muscles aching before the day had truly begun. Soon after, the children were marched to their assigned tasks, the daily labor that shaped their lives within the workhouse walls. For many, the work was physically demanding, often monotonous, and always exhausting. Older children might find themselves sewing sacks or mending clothing. The work required careful fingers and sharp eyes, but the children performed it with tired resignation rather than skill or pride. Sorting rags was another common task. Piles of worn, torn cloth were dumped before them. The staff supervising these tasks were often stern and unsympathetic. Despite the harshness, there were rare moments when the day softened. play was a luxury almost unknown in the workhouse. Education was minimal and practical, focused mainly on preparing the children for a life of labor. Meals throughout the day followed the same pattern as breakfast: simple, quickly consumed, and often inadequate. Evenings were a time of exhaustion and quiet despair. After the day's work, the children returned to the dormitory, bodies aching and spirits worn thin. Sleep was often elusive. The cold beds, the hard floor beneath, and the weight of loneliness kept many awake long after the lights were out. Yet, even amidst the harshness, the children's resilience shone through. These days shaped them in profound ways. The workhouse was not just a place of punishment. It was a forge where childhood was tested, broken, and sometimes tempered. The story of a child's day in the workhouse is not just one of hardship, but also of the enduring, human spirit of quiet bravery in the face of cruelty. The schoolroom in the workhouse was a place unlike any other, a room that held both promise and despair in equal measure. It was where the children, after long hours of backbreaking labor, were expected to sit still, learn, and absorb lessons that would shape the rest of their lives. Yet the education offered here was rudimentary at best, a mere shadow of what childhood learning might have been under kinder circumstances. The room itself was stark and bare. Plain wooden benches, rough to the touch, were arranged in rigid rows facing a blackboard stained with chalk marks from years of lessons. The walls were cold and unadorned, save for a few religious print-serene scenes of angels, crosses, and scriptural verses meant to remind the children of a higher authority watching over them. The air carried the faint scent of chalk dust mixed with the dampness seeping in through cracks in the window frames. Education was not a luxury in the workhouse. It was a tool for control. The curriculum was minimal, designed to instill obedience as much as knowledge. Reading was taught, but mostly through religious texts and moral lessons, emphasizing scripture over secular knowledge. Writing was rudimentary, a few letters, a handful of words. Arithmetic was limited to simple sums, often framed within the context of practical work or keeping order. The lessons were rigid and repetitive. Children were expected to memorize passages, repeat prayers, and learn their place in the social hierarchy. Individual creativity or curiosity was discouraged, and mistakes were met with stern reprimands or punishment. It was a system built to produce compliant workers, not thinkers. Teachers varied widely in their approach. Some were kind and patient, doing their best to nurture young minds despite the harsh environment. These rare educators understood the children's pain and sought to offer moments of warmth and encouragement amid the bleakness. They read stories with gentle voices, praised small achievements, and sometimes sneaked extra kindness into their lessons. However, for many, the teachers were nothing more than enforcers of discipline, cold, distant figures who cared little for the children beyond their role in maintaining order. Their presence was marked by strict rules, sharp words, and an absence of compassion. Punishments for mistakes or misbehavior were common detention, extra chores, or even corporal punishment. Fear, rather than love, often drove the classroom's atmosphere. Religion permeated every lesson. Prayer was a constant fixture, beginning and ending the school day, and woven into reading and writing exercises. The moral teachings reinforced ideas of obedience, humility, and acceptance of one's fate. Children were taught to see their suffering as part of a divine plan, a test of character rather than an injustice. This religious framing was both a comfort and a cage offering hope of salvation, while discouraging rebellion or demands for better treatment. The impact of this education, or lack thereof, lasted a lifetime. Many children left the workhouse barely able to read or write beyond the simplest words. Their arithmetic skills were limited, and critical thinking was rarely encouraged. The lessons they carried were more about submission and endurance than empowerment. For some, this meant a future trapped in menial labor, unable to escape the cycles of poverty and hardship. Without the tools of education to open doors, many found themselves bound to the same fates as their parents, working long hours in factories, on farms, or as domestic servants. The workhouse education, while offering a basic literacy, rarely provided a path to a better life. Yet, despite its limitations, the schoolroom was also a place of resilience and small victories. Some children learned to read the Bible not just as scripture, but as a story filled with heroes and hope. Others discovered letters and words as secret keys to understanding a world beyond the workhouse walls. For a few, education became a lifeline, a chance to imagine a future beyond servitude. Personal accounts reveal a complex picture. One former inmate recalled a teacher who would whisper encouragement during lessons, urging her to dream bigger than the gray walls around them. Another spoke of a classmate who secretly practiced writing after hours, determined to claim knowledge as her own. These moments of rebellion, small and quiet, gave the children strength to endure. However, the harsh reality remained. For most, the schoolroom was less a place of learning and more a reminder of what they lacked. The emphasis on obedience and religious doctrine left little room for questioning or growth. Creativity was stifled, and the harshness of daily life often left children too exhausted to engage fully. The long-term effects of this education, or the absence of it, can be seen in the generations that followed. Many who passed through the workhouse carried scars not just on their bodies, but on their minds. Limited literacy and a narrow worldview hindered their opportunities and shaped their identities. The lessons learned were often those of survival rather than success. Yet, within this system designed to suppress, the spark of knowledge endured. For those who clung to it, education became a quiet form of resistance, a way to reclaim a sense of self and possibility. The workhouse schoolroom, harsh and unforgiving though it was, sometimes planted seeds that would one day grow into something more: hope, empowerment, and change. The dining hall was one of the most defining spaces within the workhouse, a place where hunger, silence, and monotony converged under the watchful eyes of the staff. It was a vast, echoing chamber filled with long wooden tables and benches, stained by years of hurried meals and harsh discipline. The walls, bare and unforgiving, seemed to absorb the quiet desperation that hung heavily in the air. This was no place for comfort or fellowship. Instead, it was where the harsh reality of the inmates' daily lives was laid bare, meal by meal. From early morning until evening, the dining hall was a stage for a rigid routine that shaped the rhythms of life inside the workhouse. Each meal was marked not by celebration, but by necessity, a brief interruption in the endless labor that defined every waking hour. The food was plain, repetitive, and barely enough to sustain the bodies that consumed it. The staple was gruel, a thin, watery porridge that could hardly be called nourishing. It was served in chipped, coarse bowls, and it smelled faintly of burnt oats and stale water. The gruel was lukewarm at best, often cold by the time it reached the hands of those who needed it most. There was no seasoning, no variety, no warmth to soothe the hunger gnawing beneath the surface. Bread was the other constant: hard, dry, and sometimes moldy. It was a meager supplement to the gruel. The slices were thin, often broken into small pieces, distributed with an economy that underscored the scarcity. For many, this bread was a luxury, a small comfort in a diet otherwise lacking. Meals were served quickly, almost mechanically. The clatter of bowls and the scrape of spoons were the only sounds allowed, for silence was strictly enforced. Talking during meals was forbidden, and those who broke this rule faced swift reprimand or punishment. The silence was so complete it pressed against the ears, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and suppressed desperation. Children sat alongside adults, all reduced to the same unyielding routine. The long benches left no room for privacy or comfort. Bodies pressed together, shoulders brushing, but no hands reached out in comfort. Hunger was the common language, but words were denied. The staff moved between the tables like shadows, stern, watchful, and unyielding. Their eyes scanned the rows of inmates, ensuring compliance and order. Any sign of disobedience, any complaint about the food, was met with a cold stare or a sharp word. The food was what it was, and gratitude was expected, not questioned. For many, the dining hall was a place of quiet humiliation. The food, so scant and unappealing, was a constant reminder of their low status. The act of eating was stripped of dignity, reduced to a chore done under scrutiny. The simple need to satisfy hunger became a source of anxiety, for the line between enough and not enough was thin and precarious. Hunger was never fully sated here. The portions were calculated to keep bodies weak enough to work, but not strong enough to rebel. Many inmates learned to eat quickly, to swallow their meals before the cold set in or before the staff moved on. Some hid scraps beneath benches or tucked small pieces of bread into pockets, small acts of defiance against a system designed to deny them. The monotony of the meals was exhausting. Day after day, gruel and bread with little variation, worn down both body and spirit. The lack of nourishment was visible in pale faces, thinning hair, and weakening limbs. Hunger gnawed like a shadow that never left, a constant companion in every moment of the inmates' lives. Despite the bleakness, the dining hall was sometimes a place of quiet resilience. There were fleeting moments when a shared glance or a brief touch spoke volumes. A child might glance sideways at a friend, offering silent comfort. An older inmate might share a crumb of bread, risking punishment to ease another's hunger. These small acts of kindness were lifelines amid the harsh routine. Stories from former inmates paint vivid pictures of the dining hall's atmosphere. One recalled the fear of being caught eating too slowly, or not swallowing every bite. Another spoke of the aching loneliness felt as the food barely touched the gnawing hunger inside. Yet even in these accounts, moments of warmth emerge, the solidarity of shared suffering, the unspoken bonds forged over meager meals. The dining hall was not just a place to eat. It was a battleground where hunger was weaponized and dignity was a scarce commodity. The relentless cycle of inadequate meals eroded bodies and spirits, but it also revealed the quiet courage of those who endured. In this room of silence and scarcity, the inmates learned to survive not just on gruel and bread, but on hope that one day the cycle might end and meals would be more than a reminder of what they lacked. Until then, they ate in silence, shadows of hunger ever present, carrying the weight of their circumstance with quiet endurance. Within the walls of the workhouse, the daily routine for many women was centered around washing an endless cycle of scrubbing, rinsing, and boiling that consumed their waking hours. The laundry rooms were places of relentless labor, steam, and the harsh scent of soap, where tired hands moved tirelessly through water that was sometimes scalding and always unforgiving. A large portion came from hospitals, wealthy families, and local businesses, their fine linens and delicate garments entrusted to the workhouse women for cleaning. The contrast between the pristine fabrics they handled and the coarse, gray uniforms they themselves wore was a cruel reminder of the social divide outside the workhouse walls. The laundry was not just the clothing of the inmates. And boilers, their hands plunged into water, heated to a stinging hotness, meant to sanitize but often damaging skin. Stains had to be scrubbed out with great effort, collars and cuffs soaked and rubbed until they regained a semblance of cleanliness. Sharing these stories was a subtle rebellion against the system designed to isolate and diminish them. Many women arrived at the laundry rooms broken by loss and hardship. Some were widows left destitute, others mothers separated from their children, and many young girls thrust into a world far beyond their years. Yet the women continued, driven by the knowledge that their work, though undervalued, was essential. Clean clothes meant health for the sick, dignity for the wealthy, and a semblance of order within the harsh world of the workhouse. The washing tubs became a place where grief was silently carried and strength was quietly summoned. In those moments, the women were not just laborers. They were companions, allies, and bearers of each other's burdens. Each piece of linen cleaned, each shirt scrubbed, was a small victory, a proof of their ability to endure. The air was heavy with the smell of soap and damp cloth, a scent that seemed to cling to the women long after the workday ended. Yet they also speak of the laughter that sometimes broke through the weariness, the quiet encouragement exchanged in the dim light of the laundry rooms. Amid the boiling water and endless folding, a sisterhood formed, a fragile bond forged by shared hardship. Through scalding water and aching hands, the women endured, their spirits quietly defiant amid the endless loads of laundry and the harsh soaps that threatened to wear them down. Women exchanged whispered stories, small acts of kindness, and moments of laughter, creating pockets of warmth in an otherwise harsh existence. The sisterhood formed over boiling pots was a lifeline, a reminder that even in the hardest labor, they were not alone. The heat was both a blessing and a curse, offering relief from the cold workhouse air, but also adding to the exhaustion and discomfort. The repetitive motions of scrubbing and wringing wore down the women as strength, but became second nature, a rhythm imposed by necessity and survival. The harsh soaps used were chemical and abrasive, stripping away not just dirt, but moisture and softness from their hands. Cracks, blisters, and soreness were common afflictions, yet the work continued without pause. Mornings began early in the laundry quarters, with women gathering at massive tubs. Each piece of laundry demanded careful attention. The steam rising from the boilers filled the room, thick and hot, clinging to skin and clothing. Despite the grueling nature of the work, the laundry rooms were also spaces of connection. These whispered conversations carried the weight of lives beyond the workhouse memories of family, lost homes, hopes for the future, and quiet dreams of freedom. The work demanded not only physical endurance, but emotional resilience. The relentless cycle of washing and rinsing mirrored the monotony of their lives, a repetition that wore away hope and spirit, yet also shaped a resilience that few could have anticipated. The physical toll was evident in every cracked finger, every red palm, every blistered knuckle. Stories passed down by survivors speak of the harsh conditions: water so hot it burned skin, soap that caused rashes, and endless hours standing at the tubs. In those moments, the women found strength not just in their own resolve, but in each other. The workhouse laundry was more than a place of toil. It was a crucible where hardship forged bonds, and where whispered stories carried the weight of survival. Within the cold, unforgiving walls of the workhouse, there existed a group often overlooked and quietly forgotten: the elderly and the infirm. These were the souls too worn by life's hardships, too weak from age or sickness, to endure the relentless labor demanded of the able-bodied. For them, the workhouse was not a place of rehabilitation or care, but a final refuge marked by quiet sorrow and isolation. The elderly arrived with bodies bent by years of toil, faces etched with the lines of countless struggles. Their hands, once strong and steady, now trembled with weakness, and their steps were slow, weighted by pain or fatigue. Many had nowhere else to turn, no family to care for them, no home to shelter their fading days. The workhouse was both sanctuary and prison, a place where survival became the sole focus. Rooms designated for the elderly and infirm were often tucked away from the bustling dormitories and workrooms. These spaces were quieter, but no less bleak. The beds were simple, often uncomfortable, lined with thin mattresses and scratchy blankets. The air carried a mixture of medicinal scents and the stale stillness of long confinement. Care here was minimal and functional. Nurses, overworked and stretched thin, tended to the sick and aged with a routine efficiency rather than warmth. Medicines were basic. Pain was managed only when unavoidable, and the comfort offered was often limited to a gentle touch or a whispered reassurance. Yet, even this was a rarity, for the workhouse system was designed more to contain than to heal. For many elderly inmates, days were marked by long hours of waiting for meals, for visits from staff, or simply for time to pass. The hours stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the quiet moans of pain or the soft sighs of resignation. Movement was slow and often painful, and many found themselves confined to beds or chairs, their worlds shrinking with each passing day. The infirm, too sick to participate in labor, faced a similar fate. Illnesses common in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, tuberculosis, pneumonia, rheumatism, claimed many lives slowly and silently. The workhouse infirmary was no place of healing, but rather a holding place where bodies were kept, alive long enough to fulfill the bare minimum of care. Isolation was a heavy burden. The elderly and infirm were often separated from the younger inmates, both for practical reasons and to maintain order. This separation, while necessary, also deepened the sense of loneliness. Forgotten by the world outside and marginalized within the workhouse, many lived in silence, their stories untold. Yet, within these quiet spaces, a different kind of life unfolded. The elderly and infirm became keepers of memory and history. Their conversations, when they came, were rich with tales from a world long past, a world before the workhouse, before poverty and hardship reshaped their lives. They spoke of towns and villages that no longer existed, of families scattered by fate, of joys and sorrows etched deep into their memories. These shared stories were treasures, connecting the present to a time beyond the cold walls. Younger inmates would sometimes gather to listen, drawn by the vividness of these recollections. The elderly spoke of childhood games, first loves, wars fought and survived, and the simple pleasures of life now lost. In their voices were echoes of resilience and endurance, a reminder that even in decline, the human spirit could hold on to dignity and hope. The sorrow in these stories was profound, the pain of lost opportunity, the grief of separation, and the silent acceptance of an uncertain future. Yet, within the sorrow was also strength. The elderly and infirm carried a quiet wisdom born of survival, offering lessons in patience, humility, and courage. Their presence in the workhouse was a stark reminder of society's failings. These were people who had once been vital members of their communities, now cast aside when they could no longer contribute. Their lives were a testament to the harsh realities of poverty, where age and illness became reasons for neglect rather than care. Death was a frequent visitor among the elderly and infirm. The workhouse did not offer dignity in passing. Bodies were often removed quietly, with little ceremony, and buried in unmarked graves. Yet even in death, the stories of these individuals echoed in the whispered memories of those who remained. In the quiet corners of the workhouse, amid the shadows and the silence, the elderly and infirm lived out their final days. Their stories, filled with pain and resilience, form an essential part of the workhouse's history, a chapter often overlooked but deeply human. Through their shared tales, they remind us that behind every statistic lies a life lived, a struggle endured, and a legacy passed down. Their voices, though faint, call to be heard, urging remembrance and compassion for those who came before. Within the rigid order of the workhouse, discipline was not just a guideline, it was the law, enforced with unyielding severity. The discipline room stood as the stark embodiment of this control, a grim chamber where punishments were meted out to those accused of idleness, defiance, or any breach of the strict rules. The room was small and claustrophobic, designed not for comfort, but for isolation. The rules of the workhouse were absolute, and any failure to comply, whether from negligence, exhaustion, or simple human error, was met with swift and often brutal consequences. Idleness, or even perceived laziness, was harshly condemned. The authorities believed that strict discipline was essential to maintaining order and productivity, but for those punished, it was a source of humiliation and suffering. A single wooden bench or hard plank might be the only furniture, and often there was nothing at all but the unforgiving floor and the shadows that clung to the corners. Some inmates found ways to defy the system in small but significant ways, acts of courage hidden beneath the surface of daily submission. These tales, passed down in whispers, reveal the human spirit's refusal to be crushed entirely. To be locked away alone, cut off from human contact, was a fate worse than many physical penalties. His silence was a shield, a quiet rebellion that frustrated the guards and earned him a grudging respect among fellow inmates. Another recounts a woman who secretly passed notes to others, messages of hope and solidarity, risking further punishment to remind her peers they were not alone. Days could pass in complete silence and darkness, with only the cold walls for company. Whether it was a furtive glance, a whispered word, or a hidden token, these moments carried immense power. And freedom a place where suffering was inflicted, but where the seeds of courage and hope were also sown. Its history is a testament to the endurance of those who faced it, and to the indomitable spirit that refused to be broken, even in the harshest of circumstances. They were proof that even in the darkest corners of the workhouse, the flame of freedom flickered. This isolation was designed to break the spirit, to teach submission through loneliness and despair, but a battleground for control over bodies and minds. Its purpose was clear: to maintain order through fear, to enforce conformity through pain. Resistance, whether loud or silent, was always present, weaving through the shadows cast by the harshest punishments, and to suppress any spark of rebellion before it could ignite. The walls, though cold and unyielding, bore witness to courage in the face of oppression. Every footstep echoing in its confines was a heartbeat of defiance. It was a place where fear lived, and where the price of resistance was painfully clear. The psychological scars ran deep, haunting memories that lingered long after they left the room. Yet the experience also forged resilience, a steely determination to endure and survive. The discipline room was cold, bare, and intimidating. Its walls were made of rough, unpainted stone, damp to the touch and unwelcoming. The very existence of this room served as a warning to all inmates. Hunger, always lurking in the background of the workhouse, became a sharper weapon, used deliberately to weaken and control. To suffer starvation alongside shame was a torment few could endure without fear. Punishments came in many forms. Solitary confinement was perhaps the most feared. Reduced rations were another common punishment. Food, already scarce and insufficient, was cut back further for those deemed disobedient. Public shaming was a more visible and humiliating form of discipline. Offenders were sometimes made to stand or kneel before their peers, exposed to scorn and ridicule. This spectacle served as a warning to others, reinforcing the message that deviation from the rules would not be tolerated. The communal nature of punishment in this form made it a psychological weapon as well as a physical one. Yet within this harsh environment, stories of resistance quietly flourished. One such story tells of a young man who, tired of constant punishment, refused to speak during a period of solitary confinement. These acts of resistance were not grand gestures, but small, brave defiance in a place designed to erase individuality. The discipline room itself was a place that housed more than punishment. It held the stories of these quiet rebellions. Those subjected to its harsh regime often emerged changed, some broken, others hardened by their ordeal. The presence of the discipline room was a constant reminder that the workhouse was not just a place of shelter or labor. Despite this, the inmates' stories remind us that discipline, no matter how brutal, could never fully extinguish the human will. In the end, the discipline room stands as a symbol of the struggle between power. Illness was an ever-present shadow within the walls of the workhouse, a constant threat that lurked in every crowded corner and damp corridor. For those unlucky enough to fall sick, the workhouse hospital was the grim destination, a place where primitive medicine met overcrowded wards. The air was thick and heavy, a mixture of stale breath sweat, and the sharp, unmistakable sting of carbolic acid, a chemical used to disinfect surfaces, but one that lingered like a ghost, harsh and unrelenting. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, dysentery, and other common diseases of the time ravaged bodies weakened by hunger and exhaustion. The thin walls echoed with the groans and coughs of the suffering, cries that pierced the silence of the night and reminded all who heard them of the fragility of life within the workhouse. And human suffering was met with a mixture of cruelty and occasional compassion. The hospital itself was a bleak, unwelcoming space. Its wards were overcrowded, rows of narrow beds pressed tightly together, with barely enough room for nurses or orderlies to pass between. The stigma attached to the hospital was strong. It was not seen as a place of healing. They spoke of cold nights spent shivering beneath thin sheets, surrounded by the sounds of agony and despair. The darkness seemed deeper there, filled with shadows of fear and loneliness. But as a last resort, a place where the sick were often left to fade away. Doctors made rounds quickly, relying on basic remedies, rest, warmth, and sometimes crude medicines that offered little relief. Pain management was minimal, and many died not from lack of care, but from the inexorable advance of disease and the body's own weakness. It represented both the limits of contemporary medicine and the realities of life for the poor and destitute in that era. Those who were sicker or older were sometimes given the least comfortable beds, and the most vulnerable were at risk of neglect. The groans at night, the smell of carbolic acid, and the faces of those who cared, both harsh and gentle, form a haunting chapter in the story of the workhouse, one that speaks to the enduring struggle for dignity amid suffering. Yet, within these grim walls, patients often formed bonds, offering each other comfort and companionship in the face of pain. Inside, the sick were a spectrum of pain and despair. They reveal a world where illness was not just a physical ailment, but a social sentence, where the sick were marginalized and often forgotten. Yet, even in this place of suffering, moments of care and courage shone through, testifying to the resilience of the human spirit. Death was often a quiet, lonely affair, with little ceremony or recognition. Bodies were removed swiftly, and funerals were simple and somber, leaving behind only memories and the lingering echoes of suffering. Some were cold and indifferent, viewing the patients as burdens or nuisances rather than human beings. These caregivers enforced strict routines with little regard for comfort or dignity, often responding to cries of pain with harsh words or punitive measures. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatments were often rudimentary or worse. Some nurses, aware of the immense suffering around them, offered moments of kindness, a soft word, a gentle touch, an extra blanket for warmth. These rare acts of humanity were a balm amid the harsh conditions, a reminder that even in the bleakest places, empathy could endure. The nurses and orderlies who staffed the hospital represented a wide range of attitudes and approaches. Yet, amid this harshness, there were those who showed genuine compassion. The workhouse hospital was also a place of fear. Many inmates dreaded the prospect of being sent there, knowing it meant exposure to illness and death. Survivors' accounts tell of the relentless smell of carbolic acid that greeted them upon arrival, a smell that clung to their clothes and skin long after they left. The hospital was also a place where the social hierarchies of the workhouse played out. The mortality rate in the hospital was high. Many did not survive their illnesses, their bodies too weakened by years of deprivation and hard labor. Despite these hardships, the hospital was a crucial part of the workhouse system, a grim necessity in a place where sickness was unavoidable. The stories from the hospital wards remind us of the human cost of poverty and neglect. The workhouse hospital stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the brutality of neglect, and the small acts of kindness that sustained those trapped in its walls. In the workhouse, religion was woven into every aspect of daily life, an ever-present force that shaped routines, reinforced rules, and sought to guide the souls of the inmates through hardship and suffering. For many, faith was both a refuge and a burden, a source of comfort in a bleak world and a tool wielded by the institution to enforce conformity and obedience. Each day began and ended with prayer. The sound of voices rising in unison filled the cold halls, reciting passages from the Bible, confessing sins, and asking for mercy. These prayers were not always heartfelt expressions of belief. For many, they were a compulsory ritual, a way to mark time and demonstrate compliance to the staff and the system. Chapel attendance was a strict requirement, a daily or weekly event depending on the workhouse rules. The chapel itself was a stark room with wooden pews, a pulpit, and religious iconography that reminded inmates of divine judgment and the promise of salvation. The sermons delivered here were harsh, emphasizing sin, punishment, and the necessity of suffering as a path to redemption. Clergy who preached to the inmates often took a stern, unyielding tone. Their messages reinforced the idea that poverty and hardship were the results of moral failing, and that endurance and obedience were the only routes to spiritual salvation. These sermons were designed not just to comfort, but to control, shaping attitudes and behaviors in accordance with the workhouse's strict codes. For many inmates, this spiritual framework created deep internal conflict. The harshness of their daily lives, cold beds, meager food, endless labor, stood in stark contrast to the promises of divine love and mercy. Some struggled to reconcile their suffering with their faith, questioning how a just and loving God could allow such cruelty. Yet for others, religion became a vital source of peace and hope. Quiet moments spent in prayer or meditation offered brief escapes from the harshness of the workhouse. Belief in a higher power, in a life beyond these walls, provided strength to endure the present and dream of a better future. Personal accounts reveal a range of spiritual experiences. Some found solace in Scripture, clinging to verses that spoke of comfort and salvation. Others found community in shared worship, moments of connection that transcended the physical hardships. Prayer groups formed quietly among inmates, offering mutual support and a sense of belonging. The workhouse's use of religion was complex. It was a source of genuine comfort for many, yet also a means of reinforcing the harsh discipline in social hierarchies. The emphasis on sin and punishment served to justify the institution's authority, casting poverty as a moral condition rather than a social injustice. Despite this, the spiritual lives of inmates were diverse and deeply personal. Faith was not merely imposed. It was lived, questioned, and sometimes quietly resisted. Some found ways to interpret religious teachings in empowering ways, using belief as a shield against despair. The rituals of religion, the prayers, the hymns, the sermons became part of the rhythm of workhouse life, a constant companion through days and nights. Even those who doubted or rejected these practices could not escape their presence, which permeated the atmosphere like the cold air itself. In moments of stillness, away from the watchful eyes of staff, some inmates found private ways to nurture their souls. A whispered prayer before sleep, a hidden Bible passage memorized by heart, a secret hymn hummed softly. These acts of faith were small acts of resistance, expressions of identity and hope. Religion and the soul in the workhouse were intertwined in a complex dance of power and comfort, control and liberation. It was a force that both bound inmates to the institution as strict order and offered them a pathway to inner peace. The legacy of this spiritual struggle is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In a place designed to break bodies and wills, faith remained a beacon, sometimes faint, sometimes bright, that helped inmates endure, resist, and imagine a life beyond suffering. The stories of religion in the workhouse remind us that even in the darkest places, the search for meaning and connection persists. It is a story of struggle, conflict, and ultimately, hope found not just in doctrine, but in the quiet belief that the soul, despite everything, can find peace. Death was a shadow that loomed constantly over the workhouse, a silent specter stalking the weary and the weak within its cold, unforgiving walls. For those who entered this institution, the fear of dying in the house was more than just a morbid thought. It was a deep, persistent terror that haunted their every step. To die in the workhouse meant more than just the end of life. It meant a death stripped of dignity, reverence, and worth. Instead, those who died were laid to rest in Paupers' Fields Anonymous, unmarked burial grounds often located on the outskirts of towns or villages. These fields were vast, silent places where countless bodies rested in shallow graves, indistinguishable from one another, swallowed by the earth with no trace left above. Funerals, as understood in the outside world, were almost non-existent in the workhouse. Others clung to fragile hopes of recovery or release, knowing that death in the workhouse meant being swallowed by an unmarked grave. Occasionally, inmates would gather in secret to say prayers for those who had passed, to light a candle or leave a small token by the bedside of the dying. These small gestures were acts of defiance against the institutional erasure of identity and memory. The prospect of dying in such conditions was a weight that pressed down on bodies already burdened by hardship. The rituals that gave death meaning ceremonies honoring the life lost, the gathering of family and community, were denied to those who passed away within these walls. The workhouse was not just a place of poverty, but a place where mortality rates soared, and the line between life and death was dangerously thin. They remind us of lives lived in hardship, courage in the face of neglect, and the universal need for dignity, even in death. The loss of friends, neighbors, and even family members was a constant shadow, a reminder of vulnerability and fragility. It stands as a solemn chapter in the story of the workhouse, a story of suffering, loss, and the enduring hope that no life, no death, should be without meaning or remembrance. The marginalized were often seen as less deserving of care or remembrance, a harsh reflection of the time's values. This dehumanization extended beyond life into death, where invisibility and neglect were the final fates. Grief was often private and unspoken, hidden beneath stoicism and resignation. Bodies of the deceased were removed swiftly, often with little ceremony and less regard. But overall, the system prioritized efficiency and order over empathy, treating death as a matter of logistics rather than a human experience. Family names, life stories, and personal legacies were lost beneath layers of soil. For many inmates, the knowledge that they might end in such a forgotten grave added a profound layer of despair to their already harsh existence. There was no room for grief in the institution's rigid schedule, no place for sorrowful farewells. Gravestones, markers of memory and respect, were a luxury far beyond the means or interest of the workhouse. The anonymity of these burials was a final indignity, erasing identities and histories as thoroughly as the uniforms stripped away individuality. The fear of dying in the house was deeply ingrained in the minds of the poor who found themselves confined there. It was a fear born not only of death itself, but of the way it was handled, the coldness, the invisibility, and the absence of compassion. Many spoke of the terror of fading away without loved ones by their side, without a final word or touch to ease the journey. This fear shaped behaviors and attitudes. Some inmates tried desperately to avoid the infirmary or hospital wards, fearing they would never leave alive. Yet, amid this grim reality, stories emerge of quiet acts of humanity and remembrance. Staff members' attitudes toward death varied widely. Some treated the dying with a minimum of care and dignity, while others showed genuine compassion, offering comfort in final moments. The sheer number of deaths within the workhouse was staggering. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, malnutrition, and relentless labor created conditions ripe for illness and premature death. Inmates' journals and oral histories revealed the heavy toll death took on the community inside. The reality of death in the workhouse also reflected broader social attitudes toward poverty and the destitute. Despite this, the stories of those who died in the workhouse endure in fragments through whispered memories, scattered records, and the silent witness of paupers' fields. The legacy of death in the workhouse challenges us to remember the forgotten, to acknowledge the pain of those erased from history, and to reflect on the human cost of social neglect. Within the rigid confines of the workhouse, life unfolded behind locked doors and shuttered windows, largely hidden from the gaze of the outside world. Yet every so often, the silence was broken by the arrival of inspectors or reporters, figures whose visits brought the promise of scrutiny and, sometimes, hope for change. These inspections, rare and often superficial, were moments when the workhouse was thrust into the public eye, revealing a facade carefully maintained to mask the harsher realities within. Inspectors came with authority and purpose, mandated to ensure that the workhouse met the minimum standards set by law. Their visits were anticipated by staff, who prepared diligently to present a picture of order, cleanliness, and efficiency. Beds were made, floors swept, and inmates lined up neatly, all choreographed to impress and deflect criticism. The preparation was a performance designed to hide the daily struggles and suffering that defined life inside. Behind closed doors, overcrowding, hunger, and exhaustion persisted. But for the brief duration of an inspection, the workhouse donned a mask of respectability. Ill inmates might be tucked away, supplies rationed more generously, and punishments temporarily eased, all to create an illusion of care and control. Reporters, too, sometimes entered this world, driven by curiosity or a mission to expose injustice. Their accounts brought the workhouse into public discourse, offering glimpses of life behind the walls to readers far removed from its harshness. However, their stories were often filtered through the lens of their own biases, sometimes sensationalized or softened depending on the political and social climate. Despite these efforts to control the narrative, cracks in the facade occasionally appeared. Inspectors' reports sometimes revealed overcrowded wards, inadequate food, and mistreatment, fueling public outrage. Stories from former inmates, smuggled letters, or the testimony of sympathetic staff challenged the official accounts, painting a bleaker picture than the sanitized versions presented during visits. The tension between the public image and the hidden reality was a defining feature of the workhouse system. Authorities sought to reassure the public that conditions were improving, that discipline and care were balanced, and that the workhouse was a place of reform and support. Yet, the lived experiences of inmates told a different story, one of hardship, neglect, and systemic failure. Occasional reforms followed moments of exposure. When inspectors' findings sparked outrage, pressure mounted on local and national governments to act. New regulations were introduced, staff training improved, and resources increased, if only temporarily. These reforms sometimes brought genuine improvements, such as better food quality, improved sanitation, or more humane treatment of inmates. However, change was often slow and uneven. The systemic issues rooted in poverty, societal attitudes, and economic constraints limited the scope of reform. Many improvements were short-lived, reversed by budget cuts or complacency once public attention faded. The cycle of exposure, outrage, and limited reform repeated throughout the history of the workhouse. For inmates, inspections were moments of heightened anxiety and false hope. The promise of better conditions was fleeting, and the return to daily realities was often harsh. Yet, these visits also offered a glimpse of external interest and concern, reminders that the world beyond the workhouse had not forgotten them entirely. The role of the public eye in shaping the workhouse experience highlights the power of visibility and accountability. Where there was scrutiny, there was potential for change, however limited. Where conditions remained hidden, suffering was allowed to persist unchecked. The legacy of inspections and public exposure is a complex one. It shows the tension between institutional control and the demands for transparency, between the desire to maintain order and the need to address injustice. It reveals the fragile nature of reform within a system built on control and neglect. Today, these stories remind us of the importance of vigilance and advocacy in protecting the vulnerable. The workhouse's history underlines the risks of invisibility and the power of exposure to drive progress. It challenges us to look beyond facades, to question official narratives, and to listen to the voices of those who live the realities behind the walls. In the end, the workhouse inspections were more than bureaucratic exercises. They were moments when the silent suffering of many was momentarily brought to light. These visits, flawed though they were, played a role in shaping the ongoing struggle for dignity, justice, and humane treatment within a system designed to control. Within the harsh confines of the workhouse, escape was a dream held quietly by some who fled voluntarily, desperate to reclaim freedom, and others who were cast out, forced back into a world that had often abandoned them. The stories of those who left the workhouse reveal a complex and poignant chapter in this institution as history one of survival, resilience, and the long-lasting shadows cast by such an experience. To leave the workhouse was not always a choice. Some inmates found themselves expelled, deemed no longer fitting the institution's purpose or unable to conform to its strict rules. Others left by their own will, slipping away under cover of darkness, fleeing the endless labor, the cold beds, the humiliations endured daily. Memories of cold dormitories, harsh punishments, and endless labor haunted survivors. Some former inmates managed to rebuild their lives, finding steady work, creating families, and forging identities beyond the shadow of the workhouse. Their resilience stands as a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even when tested by the harshest conditions. Many wrestled with feelings of shame and isolation, internalizing the stigma imposed by the institution and society. The constant surveillance, the loss of autonomy, and the harsh discipline left marks not easily erased. The journey beyond those walls was shaped by struggle, endurance, and the search for dignity in a world that often refused to grant it. The aftermath is a story of loss, resilience, and the ongoing fight to reclaim identity and hope. Yet, others found ways to transform their pain into purpose, becoming advocates, writers, or community leaders, determined to prevent others from suffering as they had. Relationships with family and community could be strained or broken, shaped by the trauma endured within the workhouse. It highlights the cyclical nature of poverty and the barriers to breaking free once trapped within it. The workhouse was not just a physical prison, but a psychological one, with effects that rippled through lives and generations. Escape was a risky, uncertain act, but for many, the alternative was far worse. They remind us that freedom alone is not enough. Healing, opportunity, and acceptance are essential for true recovery. The legacy of the workhouse experience calls for a society that recognizes and addresses the lasting impact of institutional trauma. Where did these escapees go? The answer varied widely, shaped by circumstance, opportunity, and sheer luck. Some returned to families or communities that had survived beyond the workhouse walls, seeking refuge in familiar places. Others found themselves adrift, wandering cities and countryside, eking out a living on the margins of society. Life after the workhouse was fraught with challenges. The stigma attached to those who had lived in such institutions was heavy. Former inmates were often viewed with suspicion or disdain, their experiences misunderstood or deliberately ignored. Many found work as casual laborers, doing whatever tasks they could find, often in the most menial and poorly paid roles. Some turned to informal networks of charity or community support, relying on the kindness of strangers or the aid of religious organizations. Others faced homelessness, forced to sleep in doorways or workhouses' poorer relatives' homes, living precarious existences. Employment was scarce for those branded by poverty, and shelter was not guaranteed. Survival depended on resourcefulness and resilience. The emotional imprint of workhouse life lingered long after physical escape. Yet, Amid these difficulties, there were stories of hope and renewal. The psychological scars were deep. Some spoke of nightmares, anxiety, and depression tied directly to their experiences. The broader social impact of workhouse escape and aftermath is a reminder of the institution's place within a system that often failed the most vulnerable. These stories also underscore the importance of compassion and support for those emerging from hardship. In the end, escape from the workhouse was both an act of survival and a step into an uncertain future.